very much. Um, Firstly, good afternoon or good evening. I am saying evening because it's, as I mentioned before, it's midnight here in Brazil. So good afternoon, good evening. So as I told you for the other colleagues, I am a immigration lawyer in Brazil and sociologist as well. So I am developing my investigation on environmental migration on the sociological and legal perspectives. And I am personally interested in understanding how the countries have been dealing with this topic. So today I will discuss one part of this research, which is very complex. So today I will focus more on public policies and humanitarian visa to be more specifically. So I will start to talk about Brazil. In Brazil, the Brazilian government, and when I say Brazil and New Zealand, I'm always referring to the government. So in Brazil, we began to discuss the environmental migration or environmentally induced displaced people in 2010 after the 2010 Haiti earthquake. So when the 2010 Haiti earthquake affected several cities in Haiti, I will just talk some data about this environmental disasters. This environmental disaster. So the 2010 Haiti earthquake affected several cities in Haiti, and especially the capital, Port-au-Prince. Um, Obviously, Haiti at the time and nowadays, Haiti is still one of the poorest countries in Latin America. So this environmental disaster affected not only public buildings, but also the provision of public services. In fact, even before this environmental disaster, this earthquake, the United Nations had established the MINSUTA as a attempt to stabilize the political situation in Haiti and protect the human rights, and whose leader was Brazil. So at this time, Brazil was not expecting Haitian immigrants to come to the Brazilian territory, and in oh, next 1 second. Yes. So this unique, the National Council of Migration. The National Council of Migration is a part of the Minister of Justice and Public Safety of Brazil. So they were not expecting the Haitians to come to Brazil. Actually, the Brazilian government was expecting that the Haitians would go to other French-speaking countries, such as France, French Guiana, Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, not a country, but still a French-speaking place, and of course other countries in America. And when I say America, I'm referring to the continent, other Central American countries and the United States. However, in November, in yes, in November, in the same year, but in November 2010, the Haitians began to come to Brazil. So we had migration flow from Haiti to Brazil. So what the Brazilian government did, so what we can do now. So can we recognize some people? We had a long discussion in 2010. So the Brazilian government should recognize the Haitians as refugees since they were leaving a country, destroyed country that was facing not only environmental problems, but also political and other social problems. So the Brazilian government should recognize the Haitians as refugees or immigrants. So we had two problems actually. So the first problem regarding the recognize them as refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention does not include the environment refugees or climate refugees. So in the first moment, the Brazilian government decided to not recognize the Haitians as refugees. But as I mentioned before, we had another problem because your old immigration law, the foreigner statute, does not apply to the people displaced by the effects of climate change or environmental disasters. So actually this old immigration law was enacted by the military government. So the military government here was not exactly concerned about human rights. So uh, as we say in law, we had a dilemma, we had a limbo, a legal limbo. We did not have ways to accommodate the Haitians in Brazil. So what the Brazilian government did at this time, not exactly the Brazilian government, but one of its branches, the National Immigration Council, issued the normative resolution 97 in 2012, 2 years after the Haiti earthquake. So we had 2 years. We had many discussions between 2010 and 2000, from 2010 to 2012. And this normative resolution was quite important because it was the first time the Brazilian government, the government of Brazil, recognized this link between migration and a certain environmental disaster. Of course, this normative resolution was only for Haitians. I translated just the first article that mentioned the link between this migration and the 2010 Haiti earthquake. So it was the first time the Brazilian government recognized this link between a certain immigration and a specific environmental disaster. Later, the normative resolution in Brazil is different from our law. So the government has to extend the normative resolutions every year if they are willing to do so. So as we did not have any legal tools or legislations to accommodate the Haitians, the National Council of Migration decided to extend the normative resolution 97 into 2016. And of course, after that, after 2017, the Brazilian government, actually the Congress of Brazil, enacted new migration law, so the things became easier because this new migration law has adopted human rights guidelines, human rights principles. So finally, this migration law allow the Brazilian government to grant humanitarian visas and even residence permit to those people displaced by environmental disasters and other effects of climate change. I translated some articles here. And also not only the immigration law, but we also had the interministerial ordinance, which is similar to a normative resolution, This interministerial ordinance is similar to the previous normative resolution, is also for Haitians, just a way to reduce the bureaucracy, to make the immigration more easier for Haitians. So, okay, I think I still have some minutes to discuss about New Zealand. So New Zealand is another country that have been calling my attention because there are few countries, few governments actually that are willing to discuss environmental migration. And that's curious because the Brazilian government actually does not recognize environmental migration. They just grant humanitarian visas for people displaced by environmental disasters or the effects of climate change. But New Zealand government, even though they don't have a law yet, they recognize the this problem. They recognize the climate immigrants, the environmental migrants exist. So, of course, we had the Haiti versus New Zealand case. I have read this case, and this case began in New Zealand, and later the Mr. Haiti also filed a lawsuit in the at the United Nations, the Committee for Human Rights. Of course, it deserves another presentation because it's a great topic. But this case has inspired the New Zealand government to discuss the climate change migration or climate change refugees, climate refugees or climate migrations, the climate immigrants. So in 2017, the Minister of Climate Change, James Shaw, I apologize my pronunciation, said that the New Zealand government was planning to create a humanitarian visa for Pacific peoples. Very similar to, of course, it's not I am not, my goal here is not to compare what the two governments are doing, but it's similar to what the Brazilian government did for the Haitians. So a humanitarian visa for a specific problems for a specific people. And as a part of my research, I have been reading documents released by the New Zealand government. So I noticed that in 2018, the New Zealand government has released several documents, several interesting documents that has allowed me to understand the decision making. So what the New Zealand government is planning to enact or issue for which humanitarian visas the New Zealand government is planning to issue. So the first documents that the New Zealand government has released was the New Zealand response to Pacific climate immigration. So at these documents, I have noticed that the New Zealand government is trying not only to, how can I say, not only to issue the humanitarian visa, but also to invest in infrastructure in the Pacific countries. So I will not discuss this part about the infrastructure or investments in infrastructure in the Pacific um, islands countries. But what caught my attention at this document is the Pacific climate immigration. So the New Zealand government recognize the climate immigration exists. Few countries actually uh, do that. So and also the the New Zealand government wants to be the leader of this, not exactly the leader of this region, but wants to solve the problem of this region, which is a bit little different from Brazil. So Brazil was not exactly concerned to solve the problems in Haiti, but it's another conversation, of course. Um, in 2018, in the same year, but some months after the first document, the New Zealand government again recognized the Pacific climate migration and also recognized that the Pacific Islands countries are prone to natural disasters. So um, the document, this document highlights this need to help the Pacific Islanders. And in the proposed migration work program, this document was released not by the, of course, it's all, these documents were released by the New Zealand government, but each document was released by certain ministry. So, for example, this document was released by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And for the first time, because in the previous documents, the New Zealand government does not establish a plan to issue a humanitarian visa for the Pacific Islanders, but in these documents, for the first time, the New Zealand government established a plan to begin uh, to solve to address this problem. So this document established three phases. So the first phase was to reveal, actually the first and the second phases were focused on review the immigration programs for the Pacific Islanders, Samoan Migration Quota, for example. So the New Zealand government in these documents, the New Zealand government is attempting to, how can I say, to reveal already already established programs to eventually accommodate people displaced by environmental disasters or climate immigrants. And the third phase to be conducted, I have not wrote here, it was my fault, but in the third phase to be conducted over 2000, okay, I don't remember the date, the year exactly, but I think the third phase was to be conducted over 2000, after 2018. So if these migration programs are not enough to accommodate climate migrants, so the third phase is to issue a humanitarian visa for climate immigrants. The New Zealand in the Pacific and the Pacific Act, the first year was, this document actually highlights other aspects in, mentioned in the previous documents. And finally, the last document that I have found was the programs of the Pacific Climate Change Relate, Displacement and Immigration. This document actually does not mention progress on humanitarian visas. So this document actually focuses more on discuss investments in infrastructure for resilience against climate change and environmental disasters in Pacific Islanders countries. So for now, we don't have updated for with regards to the humanitarian visa for um, people displaced by environmental disasters. And the conclusions, of course, obviously, I have many other conclusions, so I just wrote some short notes. I'm open to discuss more data about my conclusions in your conversation, but I think the main point in this research that I have been developing is that few countries, of course, maybe more countries should recognize this problem, but at least few countries are recognizing this problem. So little by little, the environmental factor is becoming more important to understand migration flows. So in the past, we use it to pay more attention on economic effects or cultural effects. So nowadays we have to pay attention also in environmental effects. And the second point is the humanitarian visa fulfills an important role in these new migration policies. So not only Brazil, not only New Zealand, but also few other countries are issuing or planning to issue a humanitarian visa for people displaced by environmental disasters or the effects of climate change, such as Peru and Sweden. So, and of course, most of the countries recognize these people, this population as migrants and not refugees, especially because of the 1951 protocol that, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, does not include environmental refugees or climate refugees. So, in summarize, these are the points that I would like to highlight in my presentation. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I apologize for my pronunciation.
Thank you, Luiz. Your pronunciation of English is a lot better than probably everybody else's pronunciation of Spanish. So that's, I'm not Spanish, Portuguese, sorry. So no, I think that's all very good, you know. If you don't mind, just stop sharing your screen now. We can move on to discussion. And I'd like to just also welcome the people who have arrived while you were speaking. It's really nice to see another bunch of our colleagues who are here now, and hopefully they've managed to catch the bulk of what you've been talking about. So we'll just pass it over to anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment at this point. Don't forget to unmute yourselves. Maybe I'll start. So we've got, I mean, I can't, it's tricky, isn't it? Because everyone might be afraid of speaking at once. Do we have a protocol for how we do this? I guess you could do a hand raise or something if your Zoom account allows you to do that. Or send me a personal chat to say, I have a question. But I was just thinking, it's really interesting, I know you said you didn't want to compare, but inevitably you start thinking comparisons, listening to you talk about Brazil and New Zealand, and two things immediately came to mind for me. One is the fact that the earthquake in Haiti is a sudden catastrophic disaster, right? That just happens in a few minutes or hours or days, you know, how that unrolled, versus the climate disaster, which is happening in this slow way. So it's interesting that New Zealand is putting all these efforts into things like mitigation and adaptive responses and so on, because they have time, sort of. And the other thing that struck me is that New Zealand has a historical relationship with many of the Pacific states and of some kind of responsibility towards them. And I'm not sure, so here's where I've got a question. What is the situation of the relationship between Brazil and Haiti? Is there any historical relationship?
Not exactly a historical relation as the New Zealand government, not the New Zealand government, but New Zealand as a country has with Pacific Islanders countries. We began to establish more close relations with Haiti in maybe in 2005, 2004, because Brazil was the leader of MISUTA. So, many sociologists and lawyers are still discussing why the Haitians uh, decided to come to Brazil and not, for example, France or other Central American countries like Mexico, for example, or the United States. So one of the reasons is that this strong, of course, recent but still strong relation with Haiti that this new strong relation was started in 2005 and 2004, and also the soft power. So the Brazil still has uh, soft power in IT. So maybe it's a difference because in New Zealand, yes, I have read about this relation between New Zealand and the Pacific Islands countries. Brazil does not has this historical relation, but still a strong relation, but more recent.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Well, shall I just keep on going then? I have one. I think it's interesting. I don't know lots about refugees and migration policy and so on. We have experts, some more bigger experts here than me on this field. But I think it's interesting the point you made about the recognition of climate migrants rather than refugees. And I think, yeah, so would you like to say a little bit more about the import of that, like why that is? I'm assuming you think this is a good thing, right?
About recognition of as refugees.
No, I think it's interesting that they are, in both cases, the category of migrant is being used, not refugees. And this is a good development. Is that your view? That it's a good development that they be considered as migrants?
Well, actually, we have this discussion in Brazil. So as I work with migration law, we still have this. I work with migration law in like every day, and research sociology of migration, and we still discuss which is better. So the government, the Brazilian government, for example, in the Haitian case, so the Brazilian government should recognize people displaced by environmental disasters as refugees or immigrants, Haitians, for example. Of course, maybe we can recognize them as refugees, especially Haitians, because not only the environmental degradation, not only the environmental disaster, but also the context of Haiti. Haiti is it's a historical problem in Haiti, so they have several social and even political problems. So in countries like Myanmar, for example, and it happened in Haiti, some governments use the environmental disaster as excuse to uh, like violate human rights. So maybe we can recognize this population as refugees. But in my view, it's difficult because of the 1951 protocol. This protocol is uh, like clear. So I am afraid that if we begin to consider other populations like people displaced by environmental disasters, the countries will not accept, will not welcome other populations as refugees. So we are like extend, or we are. Um, but I think it's more important to allow each country to regulate how we welcome these new populations.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think we have time for one more question, and then we all need to move on to Luke. So, Jess, are you?
Yeah, hi, Luiz. Thanks for this talk. And sorry, I actually missed a bit in the middle, unfortunately, so you might have well talked about. It's actually a similar question to Everald's, really. I'm sort of interested in the differences and how climate change will maybe affect migration policy, and whether the Refugee Convention, or seeing people, accepting people as refugees or as migrants, will actually be enough in the context of climate change, or whether we'll need completely new ways of thinking about migration in some ways, because you think, well, like Everald said, it's such a sudden event, that earthquake, and being a recognized refugee actually takes a long time. So technically, I guess they're not refugees, they're asylum seekers in this case, because they need refuge very quickly, need to be resettled in a different place very quickly. And often for UN refugees, that's not the case at all. It's a very, very long, drawn out process with people sitting in refugee centers for years, often with nowhere to go. And then at the same time, I mean, we already see that, and I don't know what migration policies are like in Brazil, but you know, we've seen some of the issues with the migration system in New Zealand in the context of COVID as well, the insecurities COVID's posed for temporary migrants, for example, and people on RSE visas and so forth. So I'm wondering, as climate change develops and perhaps other social problems as well, whether we need new ways of thinking about migration and kind of dignified ways for people to move without borders in some ways.
Yes, as I mentioned in the previous answer, I must confess I don't have an answer for that. So maybe we could recognize these new populations as refugees, but for now, we definitely have to think more advanced immigration policy. So when the 2010 IT earthquake happened, the Brazilian government, we did not have a migration policy to accommodate these new populations. So, uh, okay, the Brazilian government did not recognize this population, the Haitians, as refugees. So, okay, they are migrants, not immigrants as well, because the old immigration law uh, does not apply for people displaced by climate change or the effects of other environmental disasters, which is shame, especially because the entire Latin America is prone to environmental disasters. So we definitely have to think about new migration policies. So I like to use this case, the 2010 IT earthquake, because it made the Brazilian government to think about new ways of migration, about adopt human rights guidelines and principles of human rights to accommodate and also relocate this population inside the country. So In Brazil, we are doing that. Of course, it's still domestic law, so we have to promote this new approach in international atmosphere. Maybe if we recognize this new population, not exactly new population, but if we recognize the environmental immigrants, not as immigrants, but refugees, we can adopt international laws easier, because refugees is a matter of international law, and immigration is in many times a matter of domestic law. So it's a long discussion that we still have here in Brazil, and I imagine in several other countries around the world.
A global discussion. Okay, many thanks, Luiz. I would like everybody to, we have a cat as well. I'd like if everybody could just unmute themselves briefly and join me in thanking Luiz for his talk today.